Hello, everybody. I'm happy to talk to you today, and I'm hoping this one's not too long. It may end up being a little bit, maybe I need to break it into a couple. But today's discussion is going to be about race in sociology. And I'm, I'm including this in the section with interpretive lenses because if you're doing race and ethnicity in sociology, then you're analyzing society through the lens of racial awareness in the same way that if you're doing it with I'll make you a little taller, that if you're doing it with gender, you're looking at society through a gendered analysis. So let's see. The two or three things that I want to cover here on today are Du Bois. I want to talk about race and ethnicity in general, and then I want to just touch on some of the controversy around CRT or critical race theory. Now, I'm not teaching critical race theory. I'm just going to talk about what it is, where it came from, and maybe what it isn't. But so I do like Du Bois versus Booker T, but let's start with race from a sociological perspective. So as far as race and ethnicity goes, you'll also often see those two ideas clumped together, and they're tricky. Part of the problem with race and ethnicity is there aren't really, we act as if there are clear definitions and boundaries, and there really aren't. It's similar to the conversation from a couple days ago where we talked about gender and whether or not there are clear definitions between the sex part of male and female. And there are, but there's some in between folks, or the gender part of masculine and feminine, where there really aren't clear differences, but we act as if there are. Race and ethnicity are similar. So when we talk about race, we tend to be talking about the physical characteristics, the morphological characteristics. What's your face look like? What's your hair look like? What's your skin look like? And that's race. And then ethnicity tends to be more about the culture, right? So, whether you have the language, the beliefs, the understandings. And so, even though, that's pretty straightforward. So, like, I have a friend in sociology who is in grad school with me, and she is Indian looking, East Indian looking, and she's Irish. And when you talk to her, she's got an Irish accent. She knows Irish things. She likes Guinness beer. It's clear that she grew up in Ireland, and but she's physically Indian looking, right? My background is Irish, so I look like people from the British Isles for the most part, and I'm here in Macon, Georgia, which 600 years ago was the Creek Indians, the Ocmulgee and Muskogee Indians. I don't look like them, right? So the physical part is race. The cultural part is the ethnicity. And so that part's not that hard to understand. However, it's the race part we tend to imbue with a lot of significance and act as if there are clear boundaries when there really aren't. So from a sociological perspective, we would say race is socially constructed, far more so than sex. And we didn't talk about social construction of knowledge and reality because I just didn't. Maybe I'll go back and make a video of that for the next time we do this class. But to be socially constructed means that we are acting as if something is real and using our language, our understanding, our symbols to make that thing real. The easiest, the easiest example to use this with is just plain old money. I don't have cash anymore, but I used to, when I would teach, try and make this point in class, I'd take out a $20 bill and I'd tear it in half, and the whole class would gasp. Now, why would they gasp? It's because, and then I would go home and I would tape the bill back together. Why? Because on its surface, a dollar bill, a $20 bill, is a piece of paper with some stamping on it. That really is what it is. If you The only reason it's more than that is because we all understand this abstraction that is money and dollars, and we act upon that abstraction by taking that 20 to the deli and buying a sandwich with it, right? The only reason I can do that with the $20 bill is that the guy at the deli understands that that dollar bill stands in for an abstraction, which is money. Now, there's a thing in sociology called the Thomas theorem, which is that is real, which is real in its consequences. So even though money as an idea isn't real in the same way that that my coffee cup is, it is still real, because if you don't pay your bills, you're going to get kicked out of your house. If you don't have a 20 in your pocket, you're not getting lunch. And it's even more abstract now when we walk around with pieces of plastic that, that somehow or other move bits and bytes and dots between bank accounts and a great big computer somewhere. So money's pretty abstract. It is real. It has real consequences because we all believe in it together. Similarly, the law is the same way. On its face, not on its face, at its very root, the Constitution is just an agreement some old guys made 200 years ago. And the laws of our state are an agreement that some folks made 150 years ago. Well, probably longer than that, but it doesn't matter. So we make laws, we say this is what we're going to do. They're just words that we put on paper. But because we all believe in those words, we can muster the sheriff to come around and lock you up if you break some of those laws. We can muster an army to defend our nation as we understand it, because we all agree that these words on a paper mean something, and we agree to them together. I could write my own constitution, and in fact, this is on one way, this is a little bit what. I could write my own constitution, but if you don't agree to it, then it's just something I made up. But because we all agree to it, we all believe in it, then we all act and reinforce it. There are real consequences, there are real armies, there are real sheriffs, there are real jails, and there are all of these things are outcomes of us believing in a shared idea and acting on that shared idea. Okay, so why is that important? That's important because when you go traveling around the world, yes, there are clearly morphological differences between people. Some are taller, some are shorter, some are fatter, some are skinnier, some are darker, some are lighter. People come in all different shapes and sizes. And yes, indeed, those shapes and sizes do correlate to where one's ancestors happen to come from. If your people spend enough time around the equator, you're going to be dark. If your people spent enough time around the northern latitudes, where they didn't get sun, they're going to be light because they need as much sun as they can get, as much vitamin D as they can get. If your people are from the Nordic places, they tend to be taller because it's better for dealing with cold. And if your people are from southern places, they may tend to be a little bit smaller. There's just all this stuff. And so we look at these differences, we see these differences, and we draw patterns and glomp them together into how people are supposed to look. Okay. Now, in and of itself, that's normal, that's natural. We build patterns and understandings when we see things. The race as a social construction, though, really hits home when you think about the way that race is divvied up in the United States, and I would even go a little bit further to say how it varies within the United States. So within the United States, we had a couple hundred years of, several hundred years of slavery, and 99% of that slavery was black. People will argue about folks along the edges. That doesn't really matter for this. And so the people who were enslaved were the descendants of Africans. Okay. Even after slavery was over, we had legally based segregation. That meant different people were going to be able to get different jobs. They were going to be able to live in different places. They were going to be able to eat at different restaurants. A whole list of these things, legally based segregation based on what your race was. As such, whether you were black or not was a hugely important distinction, and it had all sorts of ramifications for how you were going to live your life. Going a step further, it was built into the laws. When something's that important, right, you make laws about it, and the laws were defined. The law defined being black as I want to say 1/32 or 5 generations back. So if you had, and they called it the one drop rule, but if you had one black ancestor within the last 5 generations, right, so that would be first generation is your parents, there's 2, grandparents is 4, great grandparents is 8, great great grandparents is 16, 32. So you go 5 generations back, it's 1/32 black. Now if you think about somebody who, out of the 32 ancestors from 5 generations ago, one ancestor is black, are you going to be able to tell that person is quote unquote black? Probably not, right? And so you would, well, so anyway, there's just all of this distinction around who is black and who isn't black. And so now remember what I said about the Thomas theorem, that is real, which is real in its consequences. So if your ability to get a job, a bank loan, to live in different neighborhoods, to eat at the restaurants you want, to travel the way you want, or maybe even just be legally protected from terrorism, which we could talk about that too, is all of those consequences are real, and they're all based on this fairly arbitrary definition of who is, again, quote unquote, black and who isn't. So those consequences are definitely real, and it all exists because we all agree that they're real and we all act on those things, especially going back 50 to 100 years ago. It still matters now, but at least the legal distinctions are not nearly as bad. Now, if you were to go to other countries have distinctions about people, and but they may or may not be people who are black and people who are white, right? If you've got 2 ethnic groups who are fairly near each other, but don't like each other, they're going to focus on physical differences that really we wouldn't think of um, as racial differences, or they'll focus on the cultural differences, i.e., the ethnic differences, a couple of tribes or a couple of nations next to each other who, a little bit different clothes, a little bit different way to talk, a little bit, those things. And they wouldn't care about race because for them, the important distinctions were about that ethnic differentiation. Or, and I'd like to go see this for myself, but I'm told that when you get to, say, the Hispanic, the Latin American countries, they have a wide variation of different kinds of people throughout the Americas, just like we do in the U.S. And there's even a fair amount of distinction or discrimination, you will, depending upon how light or how dark you are. But because they didn't have that distinction, that hard line in the sand, that one drop rule that we did for as long as we did, including after slavery times, their folks tend to be a little bit more on a spectrum, and a little bit more of a gradient, a little bit more of a scale, and so you don't have that hard distinction of this person's black and this person's white. So when we say race is a social construction in sociology, we're not trying to say that race doesn't matter. We're trying to say that the physical differences aren't as clear and consistent as we act that they are, if that makes sense. All right, so that's race as a social construction. We got the one drop rule. I need a pen here. We got this. We got this. Oh, one more thing. So again, I think I said this earlier in class, I'm not from the South. I grew up in Nebraska, spent my college in Minnesota, and grad school was Indiana, and then I spent almost 10 years in Pennsylvania. So a lot of fairly white places, and no history of slavery in any of them. And why does that matter? Well, that matters because where I grew up, yes, race was a distinction. It was an issue. People knew about it, but white people knew their ethnicities. They knew where they came from, and I just don't find that to be nearly so common here in the South. And I've seen arguments about why that is in books and such, but up in Nebraska, Minnesota, Omaha, the town I was from, was a town of ethnic neighborhoods in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, to the point where, during Lent, because it was so strongly Catholic, you would go to the Friday night fish fry fundraisers at, first you'd go to St. Lucia's, the Italian parish, and then you'd go to the Greek parish, and then you'd go to the Irish parish, right? You could have a small town in Minnesota that has 2,000 people in it, and it might have two Catholic and Lutheran churches. Why? Because the Irish Catholics were going to the Irish church, and the German Catholics were going to the German church, and the Lutherans were going to their church. Now, the Lutherans aside, the point was that the Irish and the Germans in this tiny town are still putting up separate churches because they don't see themselves as part of the same group. So they're much more aware of their ethnicity, and if a black person happened to drive through town, they'd be like, oh, look, a black person. I'm sort of kidding, and the Midwest is much more diverse now than when I was a kid, but and then there's a whole side note here. I have done an entire class on race and ethnicity in the past, because when you really delve into it, the social history of the U.S. is really a history of the social movements of all of the different kinds of people we have, You can add in some music. It's a whole lot of fun. But anyway, there we go. So so here in the South, it seems like white people they don't really know if their people were German immigrants, were Irish immigrants, were um, Czechoslovakian, Polish, British. They're just they just know that they're white. Uh, I think that's fascinating and a lot of fun. But all right, so let's put that on the shelf. Let's talk a little bit about Du Bois and Booker T. So Du Bois is fun because, uh, and it's Du Bois. Now, if you took your high school French, you would know that his name is Dubois. But because he was an American, he called himself Du Bois. And this is a man who even spent time in France. He called himself Du Bois. So just like Weber is Weber because he was a German, called himself that. Du Bois is an American, so he calls himself that. So Du Bois and Du Bois is cool because he may have been the first, and if he wasn't the first, he was one of the first American sociology PhDs, and so that's great. He wrote like a wild man. He developed this idea of the double consciousness, which he said black folks need to have, which is an understanding of who I am in this group and who I am in this group. And his writing got to be, it went beyond sociology. Now, all that aside, well, not all that aside. So when he, and this just fits with everything we just started with, when he finished his PhD, one of the jobs he got was at the University of Pennsylvania, which is one of the Ivies up in Philadelphia. I spent 3 years in Philadelphia, so I was kind of got a kick out of this. However, because it was the early 20th century, they wouldn't give him a tenure track position, so the best he could do was be like an instructor or an adjunct. At the time it was hard for Jewish folks to get jobs in universities too. It's hard to imagine that these places were that exclusionary, but they were. So he never was actually a full-fledged faculty member at Penn, even though he was there for a number of years and taught and did research. Now, while he was there, Philadelphia has, let me get back to that. So Philadelphia has a very strong concentration of Black Americans who live in the Black neighborhood, which is fairly common for the northern cities that I've been a fan of, or that I've spent my time in. And so he's one of his first big books, and this one was very sociological before he started getting into broader race issues, was like this thick, and it's called The Philadelphia Negro. And what he did is he went to the Black neighborhoods and talked to hundreds of people, did thousands of surveys, just a fully comprehensive analysis of the Black folks living in Philadelphia at the time. So that was an important work, and interestingly, now I don't know if this draws all the way through, I'd have to think about that, but interestingly, as recently as the mid-90s, you still had a Black urban sociology thing going on at the University of Pennsylvania, and Elijah Anderson wrote, what the hell did he write? It'll come to me. But so, at the time that I'm learning about all this, and I go to the American Sociological Association, they're having their meetings in Philadelphia. Code Switch, that's the name of the book. And I get to go on a bus tour with Elijah Anderson. Elijah Anderson's an author. He's moved on. He's not at Penn anymore. But I have to think about where he is. Maybe Yale? Maybe he was at Yale. Maybe he wasn't at Penn. In which case, well, who cares where he's from? He's a black sociologist, has done a lot of interesting work in urban, or not urban, but in sociology of race and ethnicity. And in his book Code Switch, he talks about how starting at this one neighborhood in Philadelphia, you can get on at the end of Germantown Avenue, and I drove this later on as well. But so we get on the bus, where we stop at the Starbucks at the top of Germantown Avenue, and he walks us through the race and social atmosphere as it changes, starting at the top of Chestnut Hill, driving all the way down to just the roughest neighborhoods of North Philadelphia. You're still on Germantown Avenue all the way till you get downtown, and he's up here giving a discussion of how the neighborhood's changing, how the social balance of folks are changing, how people are dressing and playing different roles. And the whole point of Code Switch which is a term that has since entered the common lexicon, which makes me wonder if he dreamed it up or if it came from somewhere else beforehand. But he talks about code switching as, he says if he goes out running, because he's, big black dude, he has to, keep his hoodie down and wear his Harvard sweatshirt while he's out and about, so that he's not scary to the white folks in the neighborhood that he lives in. But you get downtown and you have to put on a different kind of front, because in a different environment you're not going to be taken seriously. You might get exploited differently if you don't look intimidating enough to be left alone. It's a fascinating book. Part of me laughed at the gaggle of nerdy sociologists sitting on the bus. It was almost like a safari through Philadelphia. And then when I went back, when I ended up moving to Philadelphia, I went ahead and drove that drive myself, just because I could. Anyway, it's cool. So Elijah Anderson, Code Switch, Code of the Street. He talks about code switching in Code of the Street. There we go. U Chicago had some an urban sociology and a black or race and ethnicity sociology perspective up until recently, and maybe still does. Mary Petito McCoy, Black Picket Fences is one of those books. Anyway, I can tell you more about that if you care. All right, so boom, 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 boom. Back to Du Bois. So anyway, after Du Bois finishes up in Philly, he ends up down here in some of the Atlanta schools, and so there's Du Bois. Now, Du Bois wanted Black Americans to do well. He was well aware of the discrimination and suffering that people were having in the early part of the century, and he wanted to, quote unquote, improve his race, right? So his idea of the way to do this, and this is fun, because of the implications. His idea of the way to do this was he called it the talented 10th. So find the 10% who are the smartest, the most capable, and give them a super high quality education, and then turn them loose in the world, and they will help improve. The stuff that they do is gonna make the world better for all of Black Americans eventually. it's almost like a trickle down theory. Okay, so now when you contrast that to Booker T. Washington, and I don't know as much about him. However, his idea was a little more was the opposite. His idea was the world might be racist, but everybody respects green. So what Booker T wanted to do was get people skilled trades, uh, carpenters, plumbers, electricians, the kind of things that everybody needed. And if you do good work, people are going to pay you. They don't have to like you. They just need to like your work and pay you, right? So what I love about this is the same distinctive approach to education that we still kind of talk about in the general culture. Do you want the smartest people going to the best colleges and getting a good liberal arts education, or do you want to have solid technical education for the average people so that they can get better jobs, right? I mean, the answer is truly we want both. They're both good approaches, but for different reasons. And right there in this literature, you see it reflected with Du Bois's fairly elite liberal arts oriented education focused on the smartest people, and Booker T's much more proletariat, make sure people can get decent jobs doing good trades work approach. It's kind of the difference between a 4-year liberal arts college and a technical school, even right here we are. So that's fun. So we talked about race as a social construct and race and ethnicity in sociology. We talked about Du Bois and his approach and how it compares to Booker T and his approach. How there's so much in all of this stuff, and we're at 32 minutes. All right, so I think that that's enough time. So let's talk about, there's been a big kerfluffle the last few years about what they're calling CRT, or critical race theory. Now, the way that this is being thrown around in popular political discourse, see, because I have my notes, what we're covering. The reason that this is getting thrown around in popular political discourse, the way they're talking about it is not what it actually is. That's the important difference I want to make. So your opinion on woke, quote unquote, as they're talking about it, whatever, doesn't matter. But they're using CRT, and where does it come from? So I've already hinted at this, but has it been the case in the U.S. that racial discrimination has been legally codified? Question mark. The answer is absolutely. So we started with the Constitution today. Starting with the Constitution, many of the founding fathers could see that there was going to be problems around race because of slavery. Why is that? Because, and how does it end up in the Constitution? Well, we have representative government. You have however many people you have, that gives you, depends upon how many, not senators, the other ones, representatives you're going to have. Some of these southern states, some of these southern counties, I saw a census for Peach before Peach and Houston were broken apart. That was just right around or right after the Civil War, and it was 80% black, which is different now that Warner Robins is a city and they're broken up. It doesn't matter. So what are you going to do with that? Well, the people in power really wanted the representation that comes with that 80%, all those people, but they don't even have legal rights. They're enslaved people. So how are you going to get around that? The non-slave holding states are saying, yeah, whatever, you're not going to let them vote. Why do you think you get that representation? The slaveholding states are saying, yeah, it's people, people got to get taken care of. So right away in the Constitution, you had the 3/5 compromise, which said, okay, so enslaved people, we won't count them as whole people, we'll count them as 0.6 or 3/5 people when it comes to representation. Clearly, that wouldn't fly in today's world. Clearly, we see that as immoral, as unethical. The important point from a CRT thing is that was a law. It was legally codified that these different kinds of people had different rights, different responsibilities, different representation. And in fact, slaves didn't have much in the way of rights. Okay, slavery sucked. Civil War happened. Don't have slavery anymore, but then we went ahead and had Jim Crow laws. And the non-Southern states act like they're better on all this stuff, and in many ways they're not. We'll talk about that in a second. But the Jim Crow laws were a way to like claw back some of the victories post-Civil War that Black Americans had, right? When the Civil War happened and the Black Americans were free people, in many places you had the rise of a Black upper class, and these guys were business owners, bankers. A lot of the white folks wouldn't do business with them, so they needed businesses, and they started running business. They started banking. Out in Tulsa, you had the whole Black Wall Street thing, and so then along come the Jim Crow laws, and they say, well, yeah, I mean, it's nice that the Yanks think these guys are equal, but they're not. And that's where you end up with the segregated water fountains, the segregated lunch counters, the ability to not do business with people. And so these Jim Crow laws, and I did mention something about terrorism, we'll get to that in a minute. These Jim Crow laws made it so that, in fact, they may have been equal, but it's equal before the law, these different kinds of Americans, white Americans and Black Americans, but they weren't actually equal before the law at all, because the law said you can treat these people differently, you can treat these people worse, you can not give loans to these people, you can not sell houses to these people, there's all sorts of stuff you can do to these people that on the basis of race that you can't do to these other people. So where does terrorism come in? Well, last I looked, and I could be wrong about the exact number, but I want to say there were something like 2,000 lynchings in the U.S. And in many cases, maybe most, nobody was held liable or responsible. Again, often the way that our criminal justice system works is you get accused of something, you go to trial, you have to be proven that you're guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. I mean, in an ideal state, this is what we aspire to, this is what we say we do. You go to trial, it's got to be a fair trial, you got to have good representation, you got to be proven that you're guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. The jury has to be a jury of your peers. And my brother just texted me about my mom, and they God, drive me sideways. Okay, so most of these lynchings, the thing that ended up happening was there'd be some sort of accusation, the mob would get mad, they'd go down, they'd murder and torture the person who was accused, and that's flat out terrorism. What it does is it keeps people in line, again, quote unquote, because you know that if you piss off the wrong people, you could get a mob coming after you, even though every step of that is a violation of what we say our goals, our ideals are. Um, and the fact that people weren't held liable means that even if it was against the spirit of the law, even if it was against the letter of the law, it wasn't actually upheld. So the actual perpetrators of that violence were protected. It was domestic terrorism. Um, Trying to keep control of a population through the threat of force and violence, with which you only have to do occasionally, but which has to be so bad that it's terrifying. I mean, that is what it is. Okay, all the way up until the 60s, when you have the civil rights movement and people saying you can't have these laws that treat different Americans differently. And that was like the 60s. For some context, my mother was already 25 years old when civil rights was going on. I wasn't born yet. I'm not that old, but this is living history. These are people who were around, and that was when folks started going to being able to go to schools, public universities. It's when people. It's when the redlining laws were struck down. You couldn't not sell to a black person a home in this neighborhood just because they were black. You couldn't discriminate a mortgage based on someone being black. That's when all of these laws were being struck down, the 60s. Okay, so what does that have to do with anything? Well, when you start talking about critical race theory, my understanding of CRT is it came from legal scholars who were going through and trying to understand the extent of these legally encoded discriminations based on race. Like it's really straightforward. The Constitution says 3/5, right? This law says these people have to eat here. This law says it's okay to discriminate based on loans, discriminate on loans and housing based on race. Now, what it means in today's world, well, I'm sure that CRT still means what it started as, but the way people talk about it tends to be very much more broadly open, broadly inclusive of just anything that sounds like a racial equality thing or quote unquote woke. So there's that. Now, there's a lot of stuff I didn't talk about here at all, right? We didn't talk about American Indians, and there's a whole history there. We didn't, I just minimally touched upon the different kinds of white ethnicities, even though different white folks have different histories. There's just a wonderful variety of stuff to delve into, which I love because it's what makes America, right? All of us different folks. I'm going to close with one thing. So we talked about social construction. We talked about Du Bois. We talked about CRT. So before I close today, the one last point I want to say, and I don't know if I said this in the gender one or not. I think I said it at the very beginning of the course. But if you want to really try and understand these things, you have to, and I mean you have to, drop your defensiveness. And maybe it's not everyone, but I don't know if you guys have noticed, but I'm a middle-aged white guy from the Midwest, right? So when I was young and people started talking about gender issues and the problems that women faced, I very clearly remember thinking, well, it's not like I don't have problems. Um, or if you're talking about sexual violence, and you know, women might be worried that a man is a has a potential to perpetrate sexual violence. I'm thinking, well, I'm not a racist. Where's that come from? What the hell? I'm not a racist. I'm not a rapist. But it's a little bit different, right? Now that I've got two grown daughters who are not, you know, huge, right? They're not going to be able to fight off someone who's 200 pounds. All of a sudden, I see why a young woman would be concerned about a 200-pound guy hanging around. They don't if they don't know their intentions, and they don't know they can trust them, then they probably shouldn't trust them. And that's what I would tell them. I tell her, I will buy you pepper spray and guns and anything you want to keep in your purse to go out into the world with. You don't need a lot of bad guys. You just need one or two. Well, the same thing goes for trying to understand issues of race and ethnicity. All of us have stories or histories that are rooted and grounded in who we are as human beings, and what our histories and backgrounds are. Like I said, my background is Irish, Catholic, Midwestern. On St. Patty's Day, my mom would make us wear the little pipe cleaner Irish pins, and to Catholic school in my school clothes. And I remember just being like, I don't get it. I don't know. I don't understand. Then you get older and you start reading about weird family histories of these crazy people, and you kind of go, well, that reminds me of Aunt so-and-so, and oh, so that's like an ethnic thing? And you go, okay. I'm mostly kidding, but only mostly. Very often in teaching a class on race and ethnicity, I'll get the pushback from white students who are responding with defensiveness and not open-mindedness. One of the favorites is, well, there were Irish slaves too. Well, on the one hand, only sort of, and on the other hand, that's not the point, right? Just because you just can't what about this stuff, right? If you want to understand the Black experience in the U.S., then you need to read these things and not say, and listen to people, and not say, well, it was rough for my people too. Was Irish experience in the U.S. difficult? Absolutely. And we could spend a whole semester on well, there are whole semesters on Irish studies, but I wouldn't do that. You could spend a whole semester on the different paths of different kinds of people in the U.S. Like I said, it's a fun class. It's interesting history. It's often difficult, and it's difficult for everybody. But you're not going to be able to understand it if your first response was, well, it was rough for me too. Maybe. Yes, I see what you're saying, but just turn that off, open your mind, try and understand where people are coming from, and you'll get farther with this material. Okay, so that was a nice quick video. I'm at 49:20. I got to see what else we can talk about for the next ones. All right, thank you. Bye-bye.